GM, everybody, and welcome back to Wellbeing Wednesday on the Metacampus Hub. This is our regular weekly session during which we get into essential aspects, tools, and insights, all aimed at protecting and optimizing mental well-being as we all on board into Web3 and also the wider and ever-expanding digital society as well. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Metacampus's own resident AI expert, Jamie Bykov-Brett. And Jamie and I will be getting into a slightly different angle on AI this afternoon as we discuss the impact and implications AI is and could also be having on our mental well-being as it continues to transform the way we work and live at an unprecedented pace. We're going to be covering some very contemporary topics this afternoon, things like the stress and anxiety of technological unemployment, the effects of algorithmic bias and discrimination, and issues surrounding things like addiction and impulse as they relate to AI technologies. This is a very, very contemporary and novel conversation. I think it's something that everybody in the digital space right now is probably feeling to a greater or lesser degree. So we're very fortunate to have Jamie, his experience and his knowledge with us today. So please do use this opportunity to ask us any questions or even share any concerns you have over anything that we're talking about today. So they drop those in the chat or in the Q&A, and at the end of the session, we'll get into those as well. So Jamie, welcome. Great to have you on Wellbeing Wednesday. And really looking forward to getting in this conversation. How are you doing?
I am very good. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invite. This is a topic that I'm super passionate about. So I'm always happy to get involved with these discussions. So yeah, thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. Good to have you on board. So before we got into the specifics, it would be good to get your kind of like sort of overall sort of helicopter wide view on this relationship between AI and how it could be implicating certain aspects of mental well-being and the challenges it poses.
Definitely. I mean, for a little bit of kind of context from my background, it surprised people when I tell them that I started off as a youth worker and actually supporting some of the most marginalized people within London into employment education, particularly in the STEM field. So connecting a largely academic industry with young people who often don't fall into our traditional means, and they have a lot of support requirements around anxiety, depression. I've had supported people from everything from suicide attempts to death threats on programs. And when we come to looking at some of the tie-in with mental health, there's so many interesting aspects of mental well-being that we don't consider from a technological perspective. The helicopter view for me at the moment is the biggest consequences are always the unintended ones that we have when we implement new technologies. There's a great quote by Edward O. Wilson, which is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And there's a perspective that we haven't necessarily earned the godlike wielding powers, the wisdom that we need for our godlike technology in order to be able to wield it responsibly with full consideration. So a lot of what I think when it comes to developing AI specifically, but I know we'll touch on things like the metaverse and Web3 as well, is that AI is very much a reflection of us. So it's not separate from us, and I don't think we should see it as that. But what it is because it's being trained on our data, on what we weight, on the biases that we have, on the confirmations that we have. It really is a reflection of us, and we have to be very careful with the kind of reflection that we want it to give. So our input for it is very reflective of the output that we're going to get from it, and therefore it can create challenges where it combines with pre-existing inequalities to magnify those inequalities in a digital landscape.
You're right. I mean, even just doing the light research, to prepare for this, it was amazing how you just picked up on some of those confluences of issues that crop up. So I think this is going to be fascinating. I'm really looking forward to getting into a bit more depth. Should we start with one of those things I mentioned before, which is this idea of technological unemployment and economic security, and how we might mitigate the mental well-being risks associated with those things, particularly the role that some, like employers, policymakers can play in this particular effort.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think when we look at our future economy and the future workforce and the landscape that we're moving into, we would be foolish to not recognize that you have to update your economic models alongside your technological models and your business models, because otherwise you're going to have a huge challenge for people. And what I mean by that is going back to the previous quote around that medieval institutions, is the institutions that have been set up were not designed to accommodate a digital workforce. They were designed to accommodate an industrial workforce. And we educated people with an industrial mindset to take their place in an industrial workforce. Now what we've done is we've educated people with an industrial mindset that they're going into a completely different world where they haven't been given the skills, knowledge, or expertise to be able to thrive within that world. Not through anyone's specific fault, but just because it's still being defined and we haven't really decided what we need to be able to do there. And that obviously creates a huge amount of stress from anxiety, depression, because our job market is changing. And one of the biggest concerns that I would have is AI can really underpin a lot of the workforce. So if you think about a job description, it really is what are the tasks that you can you repetitively do over and over again. And if someone asks you to do something outside of your job description, you're like, sod that, that's not part of my job. But the problem is, if it's repetitive, we could probably get an AI to be able to do it. So we're going to move into a workforce where lots of people's economic contributions can be matched by an AI, and that means that we are going to see changes in the job market. We're going to see changes in the skills. We're going to see changes in economic benefit, and we have to update those political, social, and economic systems at the same time if we're going to have any chance of keeping people mentally healthy and well, not just from a mental health perspective, but from all sorts of well-being perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I've been reading a lot about the importance of employers and companies putting in robust retraining programs and kind of job placement services as well. I mean, but when you actually look for examples of that, they're still quite light on the ground. I mean, I know the Metacampus, the work we're doing here is very much around retraining, upskilling, onboarding into some of these kind of new skills against that. But what's interesting, the interesting part of this for me is what policymakers, what they can do at a the state and government level to help mitigate some of this. I mean, are you aware of any work going on around that, particularly with things like kind of job creation schemes, income security, some of the kind of the more foundational work that can be done to protect people and just take the edge off that stress and anxiety?
It's something that I've literally been campaigning for since 2015. I did a TED talk which was all about preparing a generation to take their place in a digital economy. And one of the things that I find most frustrating about our current situation is it was entirely predictable. Like our changes in the job market, the way that the workforce is moving, all of this, the reason I was knowledgeable about it, because I read the papers that governments that were basically putting together to go and to say, what should we do as our future strategy? And they just didn't implement the changes that were being suggested along the way. So instead of it being a gradual increase in getting people used to it and doing this over a duration of time, they've been hit by it all at once. So some of the jobs, I mean, if we're looking at the change to the job market, Goldman Sachs' research is that 25% of jobs that are available today are going to be displaced by 2030. That's about 300 million jobs are either going to be displaced or no longer exist, which is a massive amount of our workforce and the skills that we have there. Are there some solutions? Of course there are. Things like universal basic income, I think, is an essential part of being able to implement AI, because you are going to have less people needing to be able to work within an industrial or within our digital workforce. And therefore we need to make sure that we are providing support for everybody at every level. And I think that is the most fundamental thing that we can do for everybody's mental health in moving into this, is to make sure that they have the support and requirements they need to be able to have, at the very least, their minimum level of needs met. And AI give us the capability to do it. Unfortunately, we've always been in a situation where as soon as we've seen the need for technological development, instead of going, well, we could pay the same amount of people the same to do half the amount of work, we've always gone, no, we'll cut half of the workforce and we'll save the money on the profits. And realistically, that isn't going to work with the seismic shift that's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that there is, if we look at generations, like Gen X is Gen down to Gen Z, and do you think there is any particular group that is more at risk than others? I mean, I think logically you would probably go to, I put myself in that bucket really. I'm a Gen Xer. I grew up in an analog world. I first started working in analog, and digital came along about 2 years into my career. But do you think that there is any particular group that might be feeling the pressure of this more than others?
I think each group has a different pressure that they're going to feel because of it. If you're talking, our boomers are Gen Xers, but not necessarily digital natives, but have been in the workforce for a long time, I think there is a degree of understanding what's going on and risk to job. But there's also a degree of capital that's already there, security, skills, and also decision making. So, there's a lot of opportunities to shape the world that's going in. I actually think one of the groups that, not from a technological perspective, there's economically they're still very impacted, but from a technological perspective, I think millennials are probably in one of the best situations to adapting to both worlds, in the sense of they've grown up with a digital world, but also understand that analog world. And there's a term called, I'm not sure how much I like it, but geriatric millennials, which is, can you help people from both sides of this generation to connect together? Because also they're used to using an interface where you still go into the back end of a system, you still know where a C drive is, you haven't always dealt with intuitive user-based interfaces, which is actually where you would think that the younger generation would have an advantage, but actually it's created a significant challenge with them moving into the workforce, particularly around tech shaming, because there's an expectation that a generation that's grown up around digital and has been part of that digital native world will have the capabilities to be really good in the workforce. And let's be honest, our workforce systems are not there yet. They're terrible. I still talk to clients that talk to me about their CRM being on a spreadsheet, and they still haven't updated it to actually having a drive yet. So there's a lot of kind of missing technological capabilities that fall within some of that older technology as well, and understanding that. And that's creating barriers for them going into the workforce. So yeah, I would say our millennials are a bit of a linchpin between this analog world and this digital world, and supporting with those skills development.
Absolutely, excellent. And just to tie this first question off, if there was anybody listening now that is sort of biting their fingernails a bit over this and kind of feel a bit threatened, how, as an individual, because ultimately it starts with us and taking responsibility for our own future, what advice could you offer to somebody in terms of saying that if you do find yourself concerned and stressed and anxious, what are some of the things that they can do to assuage that, but also be a bit more proactive against the downside of it happening?
It's a really, really good question. I think there's a running joke within the communities that I'm there that's both a joke and with a serious undertone, is that your job won't be taken by AI, but it might be taken by somebody who knows AI. And if you're looking to be able to secure your own future, your own workforce, build up your own skills within that space, I would say learning the ability to work with AI systems. You don't have to have a vast amount of understanding around it to be able to utilize them. That's the whole point. For very minimal input, you get a lot of output. But at the same time, the most recruitable skill in the first 6 months of 2023 has been the ability to use ChatGPT, which just goes to show that is already a very employable skill. If you're wanting to be able to make sure that that's stable for you, that's a good place to start. The other thing is obviously shaping the world around you, and you're looking at the policies within your organization. Have an AI strategy, have a digital innovation strategy. We're really not just talking about AI, but the future of the internet and e-commerce. And if people said to your business, when the internet was setting up, should we do more about it? You probably would have invested more in the internet. When social media was coming out, people said, you know what, this could be big. You probably would have invested more money in getting involved in social media early on. I'm kind of telling people at the moment that this is that next wave when it comes to Web3, the metaverse, and AI. And you might, if you see the wagon going by, you've probably already missed it. So it's good to be able to start being proactive about it now.
Right, that's excellent advice. The only thing I'd add to that quickly as we move on, because I know we've got a lot to cover, is the 3 pillars that we like to talk about on Wellbeing Wednesday of purpose, balance, and community as being kind of the foundations of good mental well-being, is really leaning on community. build, you know, talk to people if you're concerned, join communities, share your concerns, and obviously, you know, that's where, you know, you'll get the advice and the guidance and help be able to navigate your way through this as healthy as possible, rather than suffering in silence and trying to kind of figure it out on your own. Okay, let's move on to something that really that fascinates me, and that's this the issue around algorithmic bias and discrimination that can obviously lead to a lot of mental health outcomes. How can we ensure, or what can we do to make sure that AI systems are designed and implemented in an ethical and responsible manner? So this is obviously a really big issue and a big question. So it might be if you could maybe just, you know, explain the algorithmic bias as simple possible, and then move on to how we can mitigate some of that.
Sure, not a problem. So when we look at going back to what I said initially, where AI is a reflection of us, and therefore the data that we put into it is what we get out. We all know the terminology garbage in, garbage out, and it's no more true for AI than it is for any other system that we have. So the problem that we have is that a lot of the data that we've collected reflects the biases that are in our world. So for example, there was PredPol in the States, which was a predictive policing algorithm, and the way that it worked is based on historical policing data. They would send the police force to certain neighborhoods because they said there was going to be a higher chance of crime in those neighborhoods on this day, on this time, based on what our algorithm was saying. But obviously it was based on historical policing data. So where was it sending the police force to every time? Black Panther neighborhoods, anywhere that they thought there was going to be more skeptical. But then you get confirmation bias, which is, well, we've sent all of our police force and we think that, and we've got an AI that's telling us that there's more likely to be crime here. So people are looking out for more crime there. And then what happens is you have more arrests in those locations, which confirms the suspicions that you have, which that data then feeds back into your algorithm, which confirms what it's doing. So you end up with this perpetual racism, systemic racism built into your AI policing algorithm. So that's just kind of where it falls into it. And one of the challenges with that algorithmic bias is most of our data is going to be highly westernized, based on class lines, based on income lines, based on race lines, based on all of these different isms that we have within our world. A good example of this could be that if you went into ChatGPT and you said, give me 10 philosophers, 10 of the biggest philosophers over the last 500 years, what the chances are you'll get is a list of white men, because historically that's been the data that we've collected more information on, and they're much more likely to be Western. Then you've got a confirmation bias, you've got a bit of an algorithmic bias there, and then you have to go, well, actually, if I want to be able to get more kind of data from a more vast perspective, I need to say from across the world, from diverse backgrounds, from, you know, all of these different demographics, in order to be able to get the response. But the automatic is going, the reason that it weights that higher is because we have more information on it. And if we think of our AIs as basically souped up predictive text, if it thinks, oh, well, I've got loads of information on Plato, then that's probably going to be the answer they're looking for. And it just does that confirmation again. So one of the things that we can always protect against that is to be able to think about how the questions that we're asking and what we might need to be able to do to rebalance the scales.
So I guess a lot of the responsibility then falls on the tech companies and the regulators to build these kind of ethical principles in the surround that. I mean, how? So I'm thinking from an individual point of view, if you are as an individual concerned about this level of discrimination, it almost kind of feels like a hopeless situation because it's so big. But I guess on that point, you can, as an individual, you can advocate and you can probably demand transparency from companies if it's something that you're really concerned about. And I guess maybe that kind of grassroots pressure will push them towards taking those ethical guidelines a bit more seriously. But how mature, and you know, given you work quite deeply into this, how mature are those standards and guidelines? You know, they developing quickly? Is it a P1 for most companies and regulators?
If only. Ethical frameworks are beginning to come into place. There are institutions that are beginning to look at it, but most of the news that you're going to hear nowadays is around people saying, hey, we want to be regulated, but people are going, should this been regulated before? And actually, what I don't think most people realize, which is probably the most scary thought of all of these different AI aspects, is particularly for neural networks, which is what our more complex AIs are built on. If I was to describe how a neural network works, imagine being on this call today, learning something and going home and all of your family knowing that because you've just learned it. That's how our AI algorithms as part of neural networks learn. Now, one of the challenges that we have is we're not exactly sure how they learn. And that sounds weird for something that we've created, but actually, if you look at OpenAI, they're actually spending a lot of research, a lot of money into researching exactly how our algorithms produce the output that they do. We know that it works from a weight perspective, but we basically couldn't backwards engineer how that came to the response or all of the decisions that it made along the way in order to get there.
Fascinating.
Which is very interesting within itself. So when we're looking at being able to regulate these things and learn how we're going to regulate them, we're not even sure how the blooming work. We created them, but we don't really know the ins and outs of how it's doing it. And that's the scary part of it, because you can't regulate against unknowns.
That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. How do you regulate something that you don't fully understand? Exactly. It's fascinating. Okay, moving on. Thanks, Jamie. Moving on to this. This is particularly interesting for me. You know, shiny new object syndrome, which isn't a joke, but I think a lot of people suffer it. I've always been someone in my career that has always grasped the leading edge, the latest thing, but it can lead to things like addiction and kind of negative impulse control. So what advice could we offer to people who is perhaps suffering from this as they relate to this kind of tsunami of just tools and platforms and innovations coming through AI, and how can we kind of promote healthier use of that technology?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a few aspects to consider when we're thinking about impulse control with these things. Is first of all that a lot of our frameworks, we've spoken about kind of our Web 2 versus Web 3 and the fact that we've got these Web 3 technologies. And a lot of our Web 2 technologies, particularly social media, was designed as an extractive model to monetize our attention. So the more that it was able to keep our attention, the more they benefited from your attention being on it. That's how all of our advertising things work, and Facebook monetization and all this kind of thing. Now, we can change how those models work so they are not extractive, but they are humane. And I think that there is a great model that Tristan Harris has, which is a fantastic speaker on the risks of AI, where he talks about the new humane technological model, where we start to look at what we used to do from extractive models and how we shift that within the world that we're in, particularly within the frame of work reference for Web3 technologies. So I think that's really important, is to first of all stop looking at extractive models and look at how we are basing our models on this previous Web 2 space and go, we need to evolve that for a Web 3 technology. So that's one of the aspects.
What was his name, Jamie? I'm just going to pop it in the chat if people want to.
It's Tristan Harris.
Okay.
Yeah. Harris. So he talks a lot about this. He does a great documentary on Netflix as well. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it's fantastic to kind of go into it, and talks a lot about the biases that we have within these spaces. So yes, there, you know, we can start to evolve our technology to start to recognize some of that human vulnerability that happens with technology, and we have to start to weight it with some real understanding. I'll give you a good example from a metaverse perspective. Is sexual harassment in the metaverse. It's a real issue that's there. What happens? Let's give someone an example of how the technology works. So the whole point of something like a virtual environment is it tricks your nervous system into believing that you're there. That's what makes it so immersive. Immersive technologies like VR have a 27% higher emotional engagement, are engaged with for 36% longer than 2D content. You can imagine why an organization like Facebook might want to have a buy-in to a technology when they've got an attention model, and this is what they're being able to create for it. But when we look at harassment in the metaverse, people go, well, there's not been any physical contact, even if somebody is sexually harassing somebody or making movements that could be considered sexual harassment. But actually, the whole point is the elements of intimidation, of vulnerability, power, that can still be exerted within a digital environment. And quite often, historically, what we've done is we've gone, you know what, it happened virtually, somebody could have just turned it off, and therefore the burden was on that person. And we did this with online bullying for children for so long, is we ignored it because we went, hey, it's all happening online. And what we have to really recognize in this future world, where our physical and our digital worlds are further eroded, is we have to weight these challenges that people are facing with a lot more validity than we used to, because the technologies are much more immersive and they have much more power, and they've been designed around us as human beings. So I think one of the biggest things we can do when we're looking at addiction and the support that's there is, how can we leverage it in a meaningful way that plays to those human vulnerabilities and is looking after us, rather than being used against us, and those Paleolithic emotions that we spoke about at the beginning. How can we make sure that people aren't leveraging that against us?
And where do you think the responsibility mostly falls for making that happen? Is it, I mean, obviously it all starts at an individual level, and we can always come back to things like being very clear on your purpose and intention of what you're doing, constructing balance and prioritizing balance, and some of the other kind of things that we talk about. But when it comes to ownership and accountability beyond the individual, who do you think that responsibility falls with?
I mean, the only way that I can think about it is trying to compare it to models that I think work quite well. And for example, if we regulated technology similar to how we would do from a medical point of view, and we started to look at the different dimensions that we had there, if it was, let's say we're introducing a new medicine, what we would do is we would test it, we would look at how it affects people, we would do some case studies, we would do some longitudinal studies. You'd have all of that research. There's an approval process to be able to go through. You know, there's professionals that are licensed to be able to do it. And it's not that the pharmaceutical industry is without fault by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying there's due diligence there because it relates to public health. I don't see why technology is any different than that, particularly when we're looking at technologies coming out there from a VR perspective, from an AI perspective. Is we haven't, that's that godlike wisdom bit. You know, we've got godlike power and godlike wisdom. So why aren't we looking at how this impacts young people? Because if we take social media, for example, I'm sure when Zuckerberg was coming up with Facebook, that he didn't think that it would have the ability to erode our democracies to function. Okay, he thought people sharing pictures in college, not end of democracy. And the problem is the technology develops faster than the institutions are able to regulate it, and those institutions were not designed to regulate this kind of technology. So responsibility can't just be given to the individual or to politics or to the institution. I think you have to design the institutions around your technological capability. So for me, it might feel like a nothing answer, but I think there's who has a responsibility here on an individual level, but on a much higher industrial level as well.
No, that's interesting. Like, now that you're listening to you talk, you know, there is no FDA equivalent. You know, one central governing body that has the rigor and the processes that allow, you know, to kind of test things bottom up, with the necessary filters. And like, in the filter here, we're ultimately, if we're being reductionist, is being humanitarian and ethical, and making sure that what ends up in the public realm and available to people has been through the process to make sure it's safe and it's nurturing and inclusive and all the other things we want it to be. So sometimes it's what's not there that's interesting, as you pointed out. So just quickly, because you moved us naturally onto the conversation on immersive technologies, as a question here that, like, what advice can we offer people who are worried about being bullied and disassociative conditions related to using these technologies? So what advice could we offer to somebody like that's kind of using this stuff, or is being asked to use it as part of their work and is slightly concerned about those things?
Yeah, there's so many viewpoints to consider, and also ones that are going to be unique to the individual and the workplace and things like that. However, I think one of the first things that you can do is start to think about how you want to use this in a way that's meaningful, and don't just look at implementing the technology for the sake of it. Look at the task that you're trying to solve, and then look at the task and say, what's the ethics around that? So, for example, if I was using something from an immersive technology point of view, which once again, I could leverage some of those human vulnerabilities to make it better from a learning perspective. So one of the reasons I got into designing metaverse environments was because I could design it for neurodiverse people in mind and I could go, this environment's designed with someone who's autistic in mind. So I've muted the colors, I've made it less overwhelming, less stimulating, so someone feels they can engage in it more. But if I was working with someone on the ADHD or dyslexic side of that spectrum, I could bring up the colors, I could make it more engaging to keep attention that's being held there. And in my ideal world, those two people would be able to be in the same virtual environment, but perceiving it based on their own preferences. So when we're looking at implementing it within our workplace, we go, what are the ethics around it? The technology is just a tool. What's our ethical implication for it? How do we make sure we're using this in a way that's meaningful to our organization? Because it is, the technology itself is neither inherently good nor bad. It's just a tool. So it all has to go through the industrial strategy of it. And I think this is where having a strategy is really important. Looking at keeping up to date with the field, looking at how you want to be able to see your workplace in 20, 30 years time, and how these technologies are going to be implemented is probably a great place to be able to start, much more from a strategic element and much more from a conversation element as well. One of the reasons that I'm passionate about Metacampus's work, you're passionate about it, the work that we do is really important, is because you need to be able to participate in that conversation. Nobody's given you a frame of reference. Nobody's given you any education on this. The topics that we're talking about, you can't go off to university and pick up on, or you wouldn't have picked up in school. So we all have to be able to participate, to have that holistic perspective, to develop these technologies in a meaningful way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Bringing it back to what we're doing at Metacampus, without wanting to sort of toot our own horn on our own product, but it's a lot of the people that I talk to, there is this underlying sense of just sheer overwhelm, leading almost to this kind of weird sense of shame that I just can't keep up with all this, and I don't even know where to start. I need somebody to package it all and talk to me, not at me, in a way that really helps me have the knowledge and kind of the insights to have that conversation. And that's both an individual level, but also at a company level as well. So that's a really good insight there. Jamie, I'm going to jump to the last question, because I've noticed there's quite a few questions in the Q&A, and we've got probably 20 minutes left. So I just want to come back to the managing and our negative, the mental health outcomes associated with exposure to online disinformation and propaganda, which is obviously a really growing issue, but particularly through now with AI and the layer that provides, that whole area. And what role do media literacy and education, in terms of what we didn't play in that particular effort?
Yeah, this is really the big conversation, is what is real, okay? And if we had the answer to this one, I would have a lot more money behind it. So we're really talking about redefining reality and what it means. And I think that, once again, I'll go for a case study, because I think we need to put this into context to help people think about it. Is when we look at things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the way that operated was by sending people a quiz on Facebook that was just a normal quiz. People filled in, and it worked out who was the persuadables. Who, based on that little Facebook quiz that somebody did for fun, could we persuade, who are sitting on that centre line? And if we started advertising or sending them certain things, we'd be able to persuade their perspective to vote differently than they might have done otherwise. So we are influenced by this technology, and we haven't necessarily, once again, had the education or sense making to be able to make sense of this technology. We don't see the behind the scenes bit. We don't see how we're being manipulated by it. And that creates a cause for concern and a definite fear. We're worried about propaganda. At the same time, we're in a situation where we can choose our media. We can choose to we might not want to listen to something that doesn't tell us things that we agree with. So there's plenty of things on the internet that we can go to look at to tell us those things that we are going to agree with. I think one of the biggest things that we need to be able to do is to learn how to take on board things that make us feel uncomfortable, and to understand those things where we don't necessarily have someone else helping us make sense of it, but to be able to make sense of it for ourselves. And we need to have help being educated of understanding the risks in a digital world. I think one of the things that people are worried about quite a lot with, Web3 and all AI, all this kind of stuff, is being scammed. Because once again, we look at human vulnerabilities, and when we see somebody who has a lack of education or a lack of understanding, they are the perfect targets because they're vulnerable. And therefore, this is where those people can leverage that technology. So I think one of the things that we need to be able to do is to, once again, it feels a bit like the answer before, but I think it's very important, is how can we support with that education? How can we support with that sense making? How can we give everybody the tools, skills, resources they need to be more resilient within a digital world in order to be able to thrive in it? And I know a lot of what we've spoken about are the risks and challenges, but I want to kind of end this question on a what I consider to be the most meaningful part of this journey that we're going on, which is, if I think about AI, for example, underpinning societal, workforce and all of this kind of stuff, I have actually quite a techno-utopian vision on it, which is that when I get asked, what would you do if you had more time available? If you ask people what they said, most of those things relate to social good, communities, connecting with family, building relationships, building friendships, solving social causes, fighting climate change, all of this kind of stuff. And actually, if we look at our growing technological capabilities, hopefully my vision of what I think people will do is, if it does give people more time and it does make people's lives more easier, then they will spend more time putting it into things that essentially make them human. And that could be very, very meaningful. And that's where we have to strive for. And that's not me being not me just having an optimism bias on it. That has to be what we have to strive for in order to be able to make these technologies meaningful to us as individuals and as a community and as a society. And that's where hopefully we go more on the techno-utopian scale than the techno-dystopian scale.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant answer. I mean, again, I bring it back to what can individuals do and where does that responsibility lie? And I guess it's making the right decisions to seek out and expand your kind of digital and your media literacy, and like any kind of marketplace, the more people are seeking out that type of thing, the more that media companies and educators will respond. But a great starting point is coming to somewhere like Metacampus and absorbing and consuming everything that we're trying to teach and impart. Jeremy, thank you for answering this. This has been such a fascinating session. I'm going to jump to, because I know that we've got quite a lot of questions, loads of questions come in, so we'll try and get through some of these in the last 20 minutes. So the first one is I do feel that this from a metaverse say, I do feel there's a high possibility that women could be more highly affected by the impact of introduction of AI. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, very good question. It depends in what sense. How do you feel that women are going to be more affected? Is the question around positively, negatively? Are we talking job wise?
I think it's probably more negatively. I think it's kind of like they're going to be more negatively affected by the introduction of AI.
It would be interesting to see what the perspective was from a gendered perspective on why that would be the case. Once again, I would go, as a tool inherently, it's not necessarily aimed towards one gender or the other, but I could definitely see the biases aspect of it, where we start to get that algorithmic bias. Particularly, we've seen this in psychometrics and all of this kind of stuff in the past, where if we even the most popular psychometric that's out there, which is Myers-Briggs, was initially designed in the 60s to match women to the workplace based on personality, and we go, hey, there's a bit of pseudoscience behind this, and therefore that's what we're going to be able to use to move forward, and it hasn't necessarily always evolved with the times. So anytime where we're looking at a marginalized group and it comes to technology and we don't do the things to basically mitigate against further marginalization, is we do have those pre-existing differences in human capital can be exacerbated in a digital setting. So from that perspective, I can definitely see it. From a point of view of it depends on, once again, the implementation and how we're going to utilize it, which I would then be able to give a bit more perspective on whether it would be more impactful from a gendered perspective.
Sure. And Matt's asked, and I know we've covered a lot of this, but I think that what I like about this question is it brings it back to the individual, which is really the most important part of this. Is how can I balance the potential benefits of AI with its potential risks to my mental health, which is a really good question. What advice would you offer on that basis?
I think that there's that that's that balance between the more you know, the better you feel because you've got some understanding about it, but also the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. And it's very hard to be able to find that balance. I think probably one of the best things that you can do is think about what you need to do normally to protect your mental health. You know, how do you connect in the real world? How do you leverage those relationships? Do you have those other stability factors in your life that you need to be able to cultivate that aren't reliant on technology? Because otherwise, once again, you might be susceptible to it. And this is where a lot of our challenges come. A really good example from a case study perspective is Replica. People use Replica as an AI chatbot, and it's been going probably for about 5-6 years. I think it's 5 years. And what it's been used is it's basically an AI friend. So someone you can talk to, leverage these kind of AI relationships, but you've got the trust there. It also has a component of it where you could share sexualized messages as well. There was a change in European regulation where they were like, actually, we don't think AI should be doing that. So Replica changed their algorithmic bias. And what happened was actually you had lots of people depending on these AI relationships who then went through a fear of rejection, and they went through a relationship that they built with technology that was now rejecting their advances. And that caused a lot of people to go through therapy of a form of breakup. So once again, we have to think about how we're relying on this technology. What hole does it fill within our life, and is it what we want it to be able to fill within our life? So being critical and analyzing how we utilize it, but also what else we might need to be able to do as well.
Absolutely. Brilliant answer. And just to finish, because I'm just conscious of time, we've got a few minutes left. I think I know how you're going to answer this one, but let's go for it anyway. But do you think AI has more benefit to humanity? It's a great question, than danger. And
yeah,
go ahead. No, go ahead. I'll let you start.
I think it has huge amounts of benefits. Once again, when we're looking at from an accessibility tool perspective, being dyslexic myself, being able to use AI means that I can participate through different channels that might have been more challenging to me before. I think there's an opportunity to underpin society with it. I think there's and therefore meaning participation can be widened once again. I think it gives you more ability to accommodate the extremes, which benefits the mean population. I think it gives you more ability to be able to design things based on preference, not just ability. So therefore, we're able to once again accommodate a much wider range of people. I think the risks can be mitigated against, and I think that it's really just a symptom as a technology of a much bigger conversation, which is what does it mean to be human in a digital world? And that's what we really, that's what AI gives us the opportunity to find out is, let's say we do underpin a lot of our society by AI. What do we do? What would be the human thing for us? What would be meaningful to us? And that is a question that I think we're going to come up against, and that's what we're really trying to answer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think I'd agree with everything you said there, but I'd also be interested, and it's probably a conversation for another time. But it's if we frame that word danger is what needs to be in from where we are right now and what we know, what needs to be put in place to make sure that shift doesn't, the balance doesn't shift towards it being more of a threat and a danger than a benefit. But like I said, that's probably a conversation for another time. I think just lastly, because I think it's an important one, just to finish off, what are some of the most common signs of tech addiction, and how can we address it? I think we've talked about how we can address it, but if someone is worried about the time that they're spending and their impulse, what are some of the signs they should look out for?
It's a good question. I think as much as there's signs and symptoms, each individual is going to be affected differently, and addiction is different for every single person. One of the biggest things that you would need to look at is how do you feel? You know, do you feel that tech has a benefit on your life? Do you feel it's enriching your experiences, or is it creating other challenges in your life? Do you feel that you've got that sense of connection that you want? Because let's not forget, there's once again from a participation perspective, there's lots of people who might struggle with relationships in real life who are able to have that filled over online or digital relationships, or even potentially AI relationships. Now that doesn't mean that they are any less healthy, but it might mean that they're able to have a more fulfillment in life that they wouldn't have previously been able to have. So it really depends on the individual circumstances. But I think first of all, ask yourself, does it make me feel better being on technology? Do I feel better after a day of gaming? Do my relationships feel better after a day of engaging in technology, or do I find that it's been a detriment to what's going forward? And that's what you need to use to make your decisions moving forward.
I think that's a great answer. I think, with my coaching work, I always bring it back to just start with how you feel. That's how you navigate everything, everything you're going through from a personal perspective. Start with the emotion. They're there to kind of lead you and navigate you through these situations. And as you say, does it feel good? Does it feel bad? Worrying, stressful, anxious? What's got your attention? And under, baseline where you are using those emotions, and then we can build out from there to understand if there's anything that we need to work on. Jamie, this has been such a fantastic 45 minutes. Thank you for your time as always, and your wisdom. This is certainly one of the sessions I'll be watching back again, because there's lots to learn. I also think this could be part one of maybe 2 or 3 sessions.
We could go on forever on this one.
There's so much to cover, but I want thank you everybody who joined the session this afternoon. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for joining Wellbeing Wednesday. Yeah, I like watch this space for part 2 of this conversation. Jamie, thank you again, and we'll see you on are you presenting rest of this week on AI?
Yeah, so we've got one on tomorrow around building a personal assistant, and another one around optimizing G Suite on Friday. So do feel free to join for those.
100%. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you next Wednesday. All the best. Thanks. Bye now.